December 1940. Deep within the endless pitch-black pine forests of northern Finland, just a few miles from the Soviet border, a terrifying, unnatural silence hung over the snow-covered landscape. The temperature had plummeted to a brutal, bone-chilling -40 degrees. Along a narrow, unpaved logging route known as the Raate Road, the Soviet 44th Rifle Division, a massive, heavily armed mechanized force of over 15,000 men, packed with hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and supply trucks, was completely frozen in place. They were stretched out in a claustrophobic, miles-long column, trapped between the deep, impassable snowdrifts of the primeval forest. The Soviet soldiers, many of them conscripted from the warm southern regions of Ukraine, were entirely unequipped for this Arctic hell. They wore thin summer uniforms, their boots were freezing to their feet, and the engines of their tanks and trucks had to be kept running continuously to prevent the fuel from turning to ice, filling the dark forest with a low, agonizing rumble. And then, out of the blinding white blizzard, the ghosts appeared. Moving in absolute silence on wooden skis, wrapped in thick white camouflage capes that made them completely invisible against the snow, elite Finnish winter scouts materialized from the tree line. They did not launch a massive conventional frontal assault. Instead, they struck with lethal surgical precision. Firing their iconic Suomi submachine guns, the Finnish skiers targeted the Soviet field kitchens, the radio trucks, and the officers before vanishing back into the shadows of the forest within seconds. The Soviet troops fired back blindly into the dark woods, their heavy artillery and machine guns wasting thousands of rounds against nothing but empty trees. Panic spread like a virus through the freezing column. For days, the Finnish defenders systematically cut the massive Soviet division into small, isolated pockets, completely denying them food, fire, and sleep. The Soviet soldiers began to freeze to death where they stood, turned into rigid, pale statues by the relentless Arctic wind. Those who attempted to run into the deep woods were quietly hunted down by a terrifying, unseen enemy. This was the birth of a legend, the story of how a small, forgotten nation of hunters and farmers used the brutal winter as their greatest weapon to defy a superpower. It was the opening, bloody chapter of the Winter War, a conflict that would shock the world, defy every military expectation, and demonstrate the terrifying power of absolute, uncompromising defiance. To understand how this brutal Arctic conflict became inevitable, we must look at the cynical and secretive backroom deals that reshaped the map of Europe in the late summer of 1939. On August 23rd, the world was shocked by the announcement of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But hidden within this document was a secret additional protocol. With a few strokes of a pen, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin carved up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland was divided, the Baltic states were assigned to the Soviet orbit, and Finland was quietly handed over to Stalin, giving the Soviet dictator a free hand to deal with his northern neighbor as he saw fit. Stalin's primary geopolitical anxiety centered around the city of Leningrad, the second most important industrial and symbolic center of the Soviet Union. In 1939, the state border with neutral Finland was located a mere 32 kilometers from the outskirts of Leningrad, well within the firing range of modern heavy artillery. Stalin was deeply paranoid that a hostile Western power, or even Germany itself in the future, could use Finnish territory as a strategic springboard to launch a sudden, devastating strike against the city. In October 1939, just weeks after the joint conquest of Poland, Stalin summoned a Finnish diplomatic delegation to the Kremlin. The negotiations were led on the Soviet side by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and Stalin himself. The Soviet demands were uncompromising. Moscow insisted that Finland move its border back on the Karelian Isthmus by several dozen kilometers, destroying the main Finnish defensive lines. Furthermore, Stalin demanded the cession of several strategic islands in the Gulf of Finland and a 30-year lease of the Hanko Peninsula to build a massive Soviet naval base, which would effectively give the Red Army the power to blockade the Finnish capital, Helsinki. In exchange for these territories, Stalin offered a large but strategically worthless area of wilderness in Soviet Karelia. He believed that the Finnish government, looking at the recent tragic fate of Poland and the forced capitulation of the Baltic states, would easily bend to his will. During one of the meetings, Stalin bluntly warned the Finnish diplomats, "We cannot change geography, nor can you. Since Leningrad cannot be moved, the border must be." But the Soviet leadership completely miscalculated the psychological character of the Finnish nation. Finland had won its independence from the collapsing Russian Empire in 1917, and her people viewed these demands not as a routine border adjustment, but as the first step toward total Sovietization and the erasure of their sovereignty. The Finnish public was unified in its defiance. The political factions in Helsinki, usually locked in bitter democratic debates, closed ranks. The Finnish government, guided by veteran politician Juho Kusti Paasikivi, repeatedly rejected the Soviet ultimatums, offering only minor territorial concessions that failed to satisfy Stalin's ambitions. As the diplomatic talks sputtered and stalled in mid-November, the Finnish leadership knew that war was coming. Under the cover of total secrecy, they initiated what they called additional refresher training, a clever euphemism for a rapid, total mobilization of the entire country's manpower. Farmers, factory workers, and teachers packed their winter gear and marched toward the border, digging trenches into the frozen earth. By the time the final diplomatic cables were cut, the Finnish nation stood isolated, abandoned by the Western democracies, and locked in a geopolitical vice, waiting for the inevitable hammer blow of the Soviet military machine. By late November 1939, Joseph Stalin's patience had completely run out. The diplomatic deadlock in Moscow had proven that the Finnish government would not yield to political intimidation. If Finland would not step aside willingly, the Soviet Union would use brute, overwhelming military force to smash the border. However, to launch an invasion, the Soviet regime needed a formal pretext, a casus belli that could be presented to the Soviet public and the international community to paint the Red Army not as an aggressor, but as a victim reacting to hostile provocation. That pretext was manufactured on Sunday, November 26, 1939. At exactly 3:45 p.m., near the small, isolated Soviet border village of Mainila, located on the Karelian Isthmus, a series of 7 heavy artillery explosions shattered the winter afternoon. According to the immediate, furious reports broadcast by Moscow, Finnish artillery units had opened fire on Soviet positions, killing 4 Red Army soldiers and wounding 9 others. The Soviet government sent an immediate, scathing ultimatum to Helsinki, demanding that the Finnish military withdraw its forces 25 kilometers back from the border to ensure the safety of Leningrad. The Finnish government, completely stunned by the accusation, launched an immediate, rigorous military investigation. Finnish border guards had recorded the sounds of the explosions, but their tracking data conclusively proved that the artillery shells had been fired from inside Soviet territory, from a position south of Mainila. Finland had no artillery within range of the village precisely to avoid any accidental provocations. The Finnish Prime Minister offered a mutual withdrawal of troops from both sides of the border, but Moscow was not looking for a compromise. 2 days later, on November 28th, Vyacheslav Molotov officially ripped up the Soviet-Finnish Non-Aggression Pact, declaring that Finland's hostile attitude had made diplomatic relations impossible. Stalin's plan, however, went far beyond a mere border dispute. He did not just want to push the frontier back. He intended to completely overthrow the democratic government in Helsinki and install a communist regime entirely loyal to the Kremlin. On December 1st, 1939, just 24 hours after the first Soviet troops crossed the border, Moscow made a shocking political announcement. In the small, newly captured Finnish border town of Terijoki, the Soviet Union established a puppet government known as the Finnish Democratic Republic. To lead this ghost regime, Stalin selected Otto Willi Kuusinen, a hardline Finnish communist who had fled to Russia after the failed Finnish Civil War of 1918 and had been serving as a high-ranking bureaucrat in the Comintern. This so-called Terijoki government was a cynical political illusion. It immediately signed a treaty with the Soviet Union, requesting the assistance of the Red Army to help liberate the working class of Finland from the capitalist bourgeois regime in Helsinki. Stalin was so confident in the success of this political theater that he expected the Finnish working class to turn against their own leaders and welcome the Red Army with open arms. Soviet propaganda brass bands were ordered to prepare for victory parades in Helsinki, and troops were explicitly told not to cross the border into Sweden by mistake, as the campaign was supposed to be over in less than 2 weeks. But this political arrogance blinded the Soviet leadership to a fundamental truth. Instead of dividing the Finnish people, the creation of the treasonous Terijoki government ignited a wave of fierce, burning patriotism across the entire country. The Finnish workers, socialists, and conservatives stood shoulder to shoulder, completely unified by a single terrifying realization. They were no longer just fighting a border skirmish, but a total war against the complete annihilation of their way of life.
At exactly 8 a.m. on the freezing morning of November 30th, 1939, the long Soviet-Finnish border erupted into a wall of fire. Without any formal declaration of war, the Red Army unleashed a staggering military avalanche. Over 400,000 Soviet soldiers, supported by more than 2,000 tanks and thousands of heavy artillery pieces, surged across the frontier. Stalin's plan was clear and ruthless. A massive, multi-directional blitzkrieg designed to slice through the Finnish defenses, isolate the country's regions, and force a total capitulation within days. The Soviet High Command divided its forces into 4 massive strategic thrusts. On the critical Karelian Isthmus, the heavily armed 7th Army attacked directly toward the heart of the Finnish nation. Further north, around the freezing shores of Lake Ladoga, the 8th Army moved to outflank the main defensive positions. In the vast, wild, roadless forests of central Finland, the 9th Army struck west, aiming to cut the country in half at its narrowest point and sever the rail lines to neutral Sweden. And deep inside the Arctic Circle, the 14th Army advanced toward the ice-free northern port of Petsamo, aiming to completely cut Finland off from the rest of the world. As the ground forces advanced, terror rained down from the winter skies. Formations of Soviet twin-engine bombers swept over the capital city of Helsinki. Without warning, hundreds of high-explosive and incendiary bombs rained down on residential neighborhoods, turning beautiful wooden houses into towering infernos and tearing through crowded city streets. Dozens of civilians, including women and children fleeing into shelters, were instantly killed or horribly mangled. When confronted by international outrage, Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov cynically claimed on Soviet radio that the aircraft were not dropping bombs, but rather baskets of bread to feed the starving Finnish working class. This grotesque propaganda led the cynical Finns to dub the Soviet incendiary canisters Molotov bread baskets.
The brutal bombing of a neutral, defenseless capital triggered an immediate wave of shock and fury across the civilized world. In mid-December, the League of Nations gathered in Geneva, voting overwhelmingly to condemn the unprovoked Soviet aggression and officially expelling the Soviet Union from the organization. Yet diplomatic declarations could not stop the falling bombs or the grinding tracks of the Soviet armor. Finland stood entirely alone. On the ground, however, the Red Army's triumphant march quickly turned into a bloody, confusing nightmare. As the Soviet tank columns pushed through the border zones on the Karelian Isthmus, burning abandoned Finnish villages along the way, they suddenly collided with a massive, sophisticated network of fortifications, the legendary Mannerheim Line. Named after the supreme commander of the Finnish military, Field Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, this defensive system was a masterpiece of military engineering, carefully woven into the treacherous, rocky geography of the region. The line was not a single massive concrete wall like the French Maginot Line, but rather a deep, invisible maze of reinforced concrete bunkers, granite anti-tank boulders, concealed machine gun nests, and vast fields of barbed wire, all buried under the deep snow and hidden inside the thick pine forests. As the confident Soviet infantry regiments marched forward, banners flying and brass bands ready, they stepped directly into carefully prepared Finnish kill zones. The ancient woods erupted with a terrifying rhythmic roar of hidden Finnish machine guns and the precise, deadly cracks of sniper rifles. The red avalanche had run directly into a wall of stone and ice, and the first snows of the Karelian Isthmus began to turn a deep crimson red. As the freezing December days dragged on, the Soviet High Command realized that their massive logistical advantage was turning into a deadly trap. The wild, untamed geography of central and northern Finland
was not designed for modern mechanized armies. There were almost no open plains, only an endless wilderness of frozen lakes, impassable swamps, and dense primeval forests, cut through by a few narrow, unpaved logging roads. The Red Army, bound to their heavy trucks, tanks, and supply wagons, had no choice but to advance in massive single-file columns that stretched for dozens of miles along these narrow paths. Field Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim and his officers understood that they could never defeat the Soviet colossus in a conventional open-field head-on battle. The Finnish military was desperately short of artillery, they had almost no operational tanks, and their ammunition reserves were critically low. To survive, they had to rewrite the rules of modern engagement. They developed a brilliant, deadly asymmetric strategy that the Finns called Motti warfare. In the Finnish language, a Motti refers to a stack of wood fire held together by stakes, waiting to be chopped down one piece at a time. In military terms, this was a multi-stage process of isolation and annihilation. First, elite, highly mobile Finnish winter scouts, moving in absolute silence on their wooden skis, would bypass the main Soviet column entirely, slipping through the deep snow of the forest where the heavy Soviet infantry could not follow. The Finns would launch swift, devastating ambush attacks on the vulnerable rear elements of the column, blowing up bridges, felling massive trees across the road, and destroying supply trucks.
With the Soviet retreat cut off, the Finnish skiers would then strike the front of the column, freezing the entire mechanized line in place. Once the giant column was trapped, the Finns would systematically strike its weakest points, fracturing the miles-long line into several small, isolated pockets, the individual Mottis. Each pocket was completely cut off from food, water, communication, and reinforcements. The Finns did not rush to launch costly frontal infantry assaults against these trapped, heavily armed pockets. Instead, they let the brutal Arctic winter do the heavy lifting. Temperatures dropped to historic lows, and the isolated Soviet troops, packed tightly together on the exposed roads, began to freeze and starve. The Finns utilized terrifying psychological tactics. They organized tiny, ghost-like combat groups wrapped in white camouflage suits. Moving soundlessly in the pitch-black Arctic nights, these skiers would materialize from the tree line, fire bursts from their Suomi submachine guns into the campfires to prevent the Soviet troops from warming themselves, and vanish back into the dark before a single return shot could be fired. Sleep became impossible, and panic ran rampant. But the greatest challenge for the Finnish defenders was the overwhelming number of Soviet tanks. To counter this iron armor without anti-tank guns, the Finns turned to a cheap, desperate, but incredibly effective weapon. They took ordinary glass bottles, filled them with a lethal, sticky mixture of alcohol, kerosene, and tar, and attached a storm match to the side. In a grim tribute to the Soviet foreign minister who claimed to be dropping bread baskets on Helsinki, the Finns christened these weapons Molotov cocktails. Finnish soldiers displaying suicidal bravery would lie perfectly still in the deep snowdrifts right next to the roads, waiting for a multi-ton Soviet tank to rumble past. At the perfect moment, they would ignite the match and fling the bottle directly into the tank's rear engine ventilation grills. The glass would shatter and the sticky, blazing liquid would pour into the engine compartment, instantly igniting the fuel lines and turning the steel tanks into inescapable burning crematoriums. With nothing but skis, camouflage, and glass bottles, the small Finnish army was systematically breaking the backbone of the mighty Red Army. By the second week of December 1939, the situation to the north of Lake Ladoga had reached a state of extreme crisis for the Finnish High Command. The Soviet 139th Rifle Division, a powerful and heavily armed formation, had broken through the border defenses and was advancing rapidly westernward into the Finnish interior. Their objective was to capture the vital crossroads at Tolvajärvi and crush the rear communications of the entire Finnish army. If they succeeded, the defensive lines on the Karelian Isthmus would be completely outflanked, and the war would be lost in a matter of days. To halt this dangerous breakthrough, Field Marshal Mannerheim sent a legendary aggressive officer to the front, Colonel Paavo Talvila. Talvila was given command of a makeshift, exhausted assortment of local battalions, known as Group Talvila. Among his subcommanders was Lieutenant Colonel Eero Pajari, a fearless, charismatic leader who understood that the only way to save the region was to abandon defensive thinking entirely and launch a sudden, violent counterattack. The stage was set around the frozen lakes and dense, snow-covered forests of Tolvajärvi. The temperatures had dropped to a bone-chilling -30 degrees, and a thick, eerie fog hung over the ice. On the night of December 8th, Lieutenant Colonel Pajari led a single Finnish battalion on a daring, silent night raid behind Soviet lines. Moving like ghosts on skis through the dark woods, the Finns ambushed a sleeping Soviet regiment, causing massive chaos, panic, and hundreds of casualties before melting back into the forest. This hit-and-run raid severely damaged the morale of the Soviet troops, making them paranoid of every shadow in the trees.
On December 12th, Colonel Talvella ordered the main offensive to begin. The primary objective was a large, modern tourist hotel built on a narrow ridge between two frozen lakes, which the Soviet forces had turned into their heavily fortified headquarters. The attack was a masterpiece of tactical coordination under extreme Arctic conditions. While one Finnish force launched a direct pinning frontal assault across the exposed, snow-covered ice of the lake, Pajari ski units performed a wide, sweeping flanking maneuver through the deep wilderness, striking the Soviet positions from the rear. A savage, close-quarters battle erupted around the hotel. The Soviet soldiers, trapped inside the building and the surrounding trenches, fought back with desperate bravery, turning every window and doorway into a machine gun nest. The fighting was primitive and brutal, conducted with submachine guns, hand grenades, and knives in the freezing semi-darkness of the winter day. But the aggressive speed of the Finnish skiers was overwhelming. By the late afternoon, the Soviet defense shattered. The remnants of the 139th Division broke and retreated in absolute chaos back across the frozen lakes toward the east, abandoning hundreds of trucks, artillery pieces, and heavy machine guns in the snow. The Battle of Tolvajärvi was a monumental turning point in the Winter War. Historically, it became the first major offensive victory for Finland against the Soviet giant. Statistically, the Finns had shattered an entire division, killing over 1,000 Soviet soldiers while losing only a fraction of their own men. But the psychological impact of the battle was even greater than its strategic value. The miracle of Tolvajärvi proved to the terrified Finnish public and the international community that the Red Army was not invincible. It shattered the aura of Soviet military omnipotence and sent a massive wave of confidence through every trench and bunker across the entire country. The Finnish David had bloodied the nose of the Soviet Goliath, and the nation realized that they truly stood a chance at survival.
While the victory at Tolvajärvi lifted the nation's spirits, the ultimate, most devastating proof of the effectiveness of Motti warfare was unfolding further north, near the isolated village of Suomussalmi. Here, the Soviet 163rd Rifle Division had advanced deep into the forests, but was quickly cut off and surrounded by a brilliant, aggressive Finnish colonel named Hjalmar Silasvuo. To rescue the trapped division, the Soviet High Command ordered the elite 44th Red Banner Rifle Division, a heavily mechanized force of over 15,000 Ukrainian troops, to punch through from the border along the narrow, snow-choked Raate Road. But the 44th Division never reached their destination. Colonel Silasvuo, leaving a skeleton crew to contain the 163rd, turned the full fury of his mobile ski battalions against the advancing rescue column. In late December and the first days of January, the Finns executed the Motti strategy with terrifying mathematical perfection. They blocked the road ahead of the division, destroyed their rear supply lines, and then systematically cut the massive 4-mile-long column into several isolated segments. What followed was not a conventional battle, but a slow industrial slaughter orchestrated by the Arctic elements and invisible hunters. Temperatures on the Raate Road plummeted to an unearthly -40 degrees. The Soviet troops, trapped on the exposed road without winter clothing, tents, or wood for fire, began to freeze to death by the thousands. Their multi-ton tanks and armored cars became frozen blocks of useless steel, running out of fuel and blocking all movement. Whenever the desperate soldiers tried to build a small fire to warm their frostbitten limbs, the rhythmic, lethal bark of Finnish Suomi submachine guns would echo from the dark tree line, leaving nothing but bodies around the embers.
By January 6, 1940, the order was given for the remnants of the division to break out and retreat toward the Soviet border in a desperate, uncoordinated panic. But there was no escape. The Finnish skiers pursued them relentlessly through the deep snowdrifts, hunting down the fleeing survivors. The Raate Road became a vast, open-air graveyard. Over 4,000 Soviet soldiers were killed in action or frozen to death, while thousands more were wounded or captured. Colonel Silaswy's forces achieved this staggering victory, losing only a few hundred of their own men. The material trophies captured by the small Finnish army were monumental, effectively rearming their entire northern front. The Finns dug out of the snow 43 operational tanks, 71 heavy artillery pieces, nearly 300 machine guns, thousands of rifles, and hundreds of functional trucks and horses. The image of the Raate Road, covered in a thick layer of ice, burning wreckage, and the rigid snow-covered statues of fallen soldiers, shocked the international press and exposed the severe structural, tactical, and logistical weaknesses of Stalin's military machine. Against all odds, the first phase of the Winter War ended in a total, miraculous victory for the Finnish defenders. The Blitzkrieg had failed. But the Soviet giant was not defeated. It was merely humiliated. And a furious Stalin was already preparing a monstrous, unstoppable retaliation.
Every single week, we bring you new, in-depth breakdowns of the most critical events, hidden strategies, and untold stories of the war. To make sure you never miss an episode, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. Your support is what keeps this project alive. If you found this story compelling, please leave a like and don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comment section below. We read and reply to every single one. Thank you for watching, stay tuned, and we will see you in the next video.